to our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. We are in the series of videos explaining about open source software adoption for healthcare organizations, and we have gone through several videos explaining the meaning of open source. We have talked about open source initiative, an organization which protects the use of open source. We have talked about even the free software foundation that protect the use of free software. So today we will proceed with the video explaining the open source licenses, because we have been talking about licenses in the previous videos. Now it is very important for us to talk about these licenses. By the way, what are licenses? The open source licenses, actually these are the legal bindings, contracts between the author, that means the person who has developed a certain a program, and the user of the software component. So it's a kind of contract. It's a kind of contract where the license is in fact what turns a code into being an open source software or not being an open source software. So each open source license states what users are permitted to do with the software component, their obligations, and what they cannot do as per terms and conditions. There are categories. There are a number of categories of these licenses. Some fall under open source licenses and others are not open source licenses. For open source licenses, we have two categories. We have the copyleft licenses and permissive licenses. With other softwares and other creative works, we can have other types of licenses like copyright licenses and Creative Commons licenses. In the next slide, we'll be explaining what these categories mean. So before going further, we will talk a little bit about copyright and copyleft. Speaking of copyright, this is a law that restricts the right to use, the right to modify, right to share creative works without the permission of the copyright holder. So, for example, a person has produced his music, then he has what we call rights over that music. He is the copyright holder. The same as with a person who has developed a software can have all the rights, and in that case, if that person restricts, that means make others not to use that software, make them not to modify, not to share his creative work without his permission, then we say that kind of license is called a copyright. So think about music, think about movies. You are not allowed to copy, you are not allowed to modify, you are not allowed to share those kind of works simply because they are the intellectual properties of the creators. So creators can put restrictions on modifying, restrictions on using, and restrictions on sharing such creative works. If that is the case, then we say that is copyright. But when another person releases a program, or you release any creative work under a copyleft license, it means that they make a claim that they put a kind of copyright of the work, and to issue a statement that other people have the right to use, to modify, and share the work as long as the reciprocity of the obligation is maintained. So copyleft is a kind of vice versa for copy right. That means with the copyleft, the users are not restricted to modify, they are not restricted to use or to share the creative work. In short, if you are using a component of an open source license that is copyleft, then they too should use or should allow others to modify, others to use, others to share the source code. So examples of open source software licenses that fall under copyleft licensing are GNU General Public License and Eclipse Public License. In fact, there are others, but these are the most popular. We have another type of license, another category of license that is called the permissive open source license. This is against the copyleft. With the permissive open source license, it means that it guarantees the freedom to use, the freedom to modify, and to redistribute. But the difference is that with the copyleft, if you adopt license with copyleft, it means that even the derivative works, the works that follow after the original work must adhere with the copyleft license. But with the permissive license, it means that it allows or it permits even proprietary derivative works to use. In fact, permissive open source licenses place minimal restrictions on how others can use open source components. So there are minimal restrictions as compared to copyleft. That means that this type of license allows varying degrees of freedom to use, varying degrees of freedom to modify, and to redistribute the open source code. In that case, it permits its use even in proprietary derivative works, and it requires nearly nothing in return in regards to obligation of moving forward. So if you are to choose between copyleft and copyright, the thing that differentiates the two is that if you opt for copyleft, it means that even the works that will modify your work should adhere with the copyleft license. But with the permissive licenses, it gives freedom for a person to even derive it to be a proprietary software. Another type of or category of open source license, we call it Creative Commons. In fact, this is a public license, and it can be used to indicate what other people are allowed to do with your work. In this case, each work is automatically protected by copyright, which means that others will need to ask permission from you as the copyright owner. So Creative Commons licenses let you easily change your copyright terms from the default we call all rights reserved to some rights reserved. They are legal tools to give permission in advance to share and use your work on conditions of your choice. For example, if you are a YouTube creator, if you are one among the people that post videos in YouTube, there is this kind of license that is used. YouTube allows creators to mark their videos with a Creative Commons license. If you have marked your video with the Creative Commons by license, you retain your copyright. Other creators must get to reuse your work subject to the terms of the license. So you can put what we call all rights reserved. That means no any other video owner or video channel owner of YouTube can use your work. So that is one example of Creative Commons licenses. Now let's talk about these licenses in details. The open source license. It is not important to it is not important to say one license. It is not important to say that one license is more important than the other. You should note that there are no good or bad licenses, and that no one license is better than the other. It depends. Anyone can create an open source license that suits their fans, which is the reason that there are many licenses that are found under open source umbrella. And open source initiative, that organization put a list of approved licenses, and it consists of about 80 open source licenses that are mostly commonly used. So in here, we have just selected a few open source licenses that are popular. For example, in the copyleft licenses, we'll talk about GNU General Public Licenses, Eclipse Public Licenses, and Mozilla Public Licenses. And under permissive licenses, we'll talk about BSD licenses, MIT licenses, and Apache licenses. Starting with GNU General Public Licenses, GPL. This is a series of free software licenses. As you remember, in the last videos, we talk about the free software and the open source software. And we say that literally all open source softwares are free software. So GPL is a series of free software licenses that guarantees end users to freedom to run, study, share, and modify the software. This GNU General Public License, in short we call it GPL, grants the recipients of the computer program all the rights of the free software definition. Remember, the Free Software Association has also a free software definition that consists of 4 criteria. It gives freedom, 4 freedoms. So the GPL series are all copyleft licenses. That means that any derivative work must be distributed under the same or equivalent license terms. GPL was the first copyleft license for general use. So speaking of copyleft licenses, then GPL was the first license. GPL is intended to guarantee freedom to share and freedom to change all the versions of the program to make sure that it remains free software for all its users. The Free Software Foundation that we talked in last videos use GNU General Public License for almost all their software, and it applies also to any other works that are released in that way. For example, let me give you an example of how you can implement GNU General Public License. If you decide to use GNU General Public License and you distribute your copies of a program, whether for free or for a certain gratis, then you must pass on to the recipients the same freedoms that you received. So if you have adopted GNU GPL a GPL license, then your software must also adhere to the license that is the GPL. You must make sure that the people that also adopt your software, they also receive or get the source code as you have been given the source code. So developers that use GPL protect rights to their recipients through 2 steps. The first step, they assert copyright on the software to their users, and the second, they offer this license to their users, giving them the legal permission to copy, to distribute, or to modify the source code. So we have a number of softwares that are using GPL license, GNU General Public License. One such software is called Clear Health. Another one, we call it ERP Next. Another one, we call it Open MRIS. Another one, we call it Open Dental. And we have Open Hospital, and another one, IHRS. We have another type of license, we call it Public Domain License, PL. This consists of all the creative work to which no exclusive intellectual property rights apply. Those rights may have expired, let's say, or they have been forfeited, or expressly waived, or they may be inapplicable at all. Think of this. For example, if you have public domain license, it means if a public domain license, for example, a song that was created, let's say, 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, and now it has expired, then no one has rights to that kind of a song. So the same with the a software, then we can have a public domain software that that means we for example, we have some open source software such as AppInfo and HoExp. These, they use a public domain license. That means these creative works have no exclusive intellectual property rights that apply to them. Another type or another license, we call it Mozilla Public License, MPL. This is a free and open source software license. It is developed and maintained by the Mozilla Foundation. If you remember, last video we talked about the other types of softwares apart from open source, and we talked about FOSS, free and open source software. So Mozilla Public License is a free and open source software license, and it is developed and maintained by the Mozilla Foundation. In fact, this uses a wiki copyleft license. That means it is not much restrictive, and it is characterized as a middle ground between permissive software license and GPL. So it is in between. And why it is in between? Because it seeks to balance the concerns of people that develop proprietary software and the people that develop open source software. So it is the license for Mozilla Firefox, it is the license for Mozilla Thunderbird, and even other Mozilla softwares. In healthcare, a software that uses Mozilla public license is OpenMRS. OpenMRS. Another type of license that we talk about is Apache license. Apache license. This is a permissive free software license. It is written by Apache Software Foundation, AFC, Apache Software Foundation. It allows for any purpose software. It allows for to be distributed. It allows for modifications. It allows for distribution of modified versions of the software that fall under the terms of the license without any concern for loyalties, any concern for fees, etc. The Apache Software Foundation and its project, they release their software products under this license that is called the Apache license. And the Apache license, in fact, is permissive license. Unlike copyleft license, this permissive license does not require the derivative work of the software or the modifications of the original software to be distributed using the same license. For example, software that use Apache license include Pop Health and ZPRS. The last license that we are discussing is called the Berkeley Software Distribution license. We call it BSD license. These are the family of permissive free software licenses, and they impose minimal restrictions on the use and the distribution of covered software. It is in contrast with the copyleft license. That copyleft licenses have, or these BSD licenses, the permissive licenses, they have a share-like requirements. That means they impose minimal restrictions on the use, on the distribution, and even redistribution of the softwares or the modified softwares. We have a number of examples of open source software that have or that use BSD licenses, but in health, the most common is DHIS2, District Health Information System 2. So thank you very much for following Elimika Mtandao. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and comment. If you have any question, put your comment there, and I will answer such question. Thank you very much for following Elimika Mtandaoni.